Do you want your business to grow faster? Are you open to new and out-of-the-box ways to drive revenues and increase value? How do you imagine the most successful entrepreneurs and business leaders double, triple, or expand their businesses tenfold or more? The answer is deals. This is a weekly podcast featuring conversations with business owners, executives, and leaders as we reveal behind-the-scenes details that give you, our listeners, the confidence to pursue your own deal-driven growth. On this show, we discuss a huge variety of deals, everything from large, complex mergers and acquisitions, capital raising, joint ventures, strategic alliances, real estate, affiliate and sponsorship deals, franchising, and more. My name is Corey Kupfer, and I've been supporting deal-driven growth for businesses for over 35 years as a successful entrepreneur, professional negotiator, and attorney. My goal is to help you strategize, plan for, find, and complete deals that will help your company grow faster. Welcome to the Deal Quest podcast. Let's get started. So folks, in today's solo cast, I want to talk to you about my love-hate relationship with Shark Tank as a deal maker. So, it's interesting. There's actually been studies on Shark Tank. There's been a lot written on it. Obviously, it's been on for a long, long time. And in the beginning of the show, especially, I really liked it because, it's definitely entertaining. And there are things about it that are informative. I mean, for me, I watch it less now. I catch clips on YouTube. And I guess maybe over time, I would have hoped maybe they would have evolved it in a way that it would have given people a more sophisticated understanding of deals. Because I think in the beginning, listen, let's face it, when they first went on the air, there weren't that many shows like that were popular, at least in the U.S. So actually, I believe Dragon's Den in the U.K. was the first version of this that Shark Tank sort of took off the idea from. But in any case, it served this purpose, and it still does, right? People who are in the general public, people who are early to deals, they get to see certain things that are realistic, right? They get to see the things that investors at a fundamental level at least start to look for, right? There are things like customer acquisition costs that they always ask about. That's a big one that the sharks will ask about. So, okay, now people understand in certain those kind of businesses that customer acquisition cost is a factor that you should be considering in your business in general, just as a good measurement or KPI in certain types of business, but also something that investors care about. So that's good, right? People, they want to know revenue, they want to know profit, they want to know growth. They ask those kind of questions. Okay, yes, those are all important in realistic pitches. And often, Kevin O'Leary says this a lot about the show, that one of the great things about Shark Tank is that it helps bring down customer acquisition costs. It's actually one of the leverage points of the show, because obviously, and this is true, by the way, even for pitches that don't get an investment, they get exposure, right? And they usually get a hit of orders. And by the way, for some companies, that's a problem. I mean, there's been examples of Shark Tank companies that have gotten overwhelmed and haven't delivered, and then their reputation goes down, right? So, as the years gone on, for the most part, the pitches are more sophisticated, and I think they've done a better job of anticipating the potential Shark Tank bump. But, in the early days, especially, there were some companies that ran into trouble with that. So these are some of the positive things. It also is a great inspiration for entrepreneurship in general, right? It's cool to see people like Mark Cuban and, Robert Herjavec, Kevin O'Leary, and Barbara Corcoran, and, Lori and Damon, and all the guest sharks they've had, and the way they think about certain things in business. So that's all positive. And listen, let's face it, it's entertainment. It's a TV show. So as entertainment, it's fun and interesting, or at least it was for me for a number of seasons. And for some people, it still is, okay? So I don't want to totally hate on it. In fact, there's a reason I call this having a love-hate relationship with Shark Tank. But as a deal maker, as a lawyer who does deals, as a negotiator, things like that, I have a few things with it. So first of all, let's talk about it from a negotiating point of view. And Mark Cuban's the biggest one who does this. So he puts a shot clock on the offer and says, you got to tell me now, and I'm not going to compete with these other sharks, et cetera. And listen, it's a great negotiating tool in the moment, but I will tell you that it's not realistic on the way, people pitch money. I mean, when you go to investors, if they express that they're interested, they're going to come back, they're going to send you a term sheet. You can be shopping around the deal. Yes. I mean, will an investor say, hey, give some sort of like, hey, listen, if you want me, let me know that I'm in. But I don't know of situations very often where you're on the spot, on a 24-second shot clock, so to speak, and you're on the spot. Because listen, people, the true venture capital and, investors, actually, want the founders of the company to be, not to have buyer's remorse, so to speak, not to feel pressure, because you got to go through a whole process, right? There's an LOI that's presented, it's negotiated, whatever, you have definitive documents. There's a lot of chances to change your mind if you feel pressured into a deal. Now, listen, obviously, it's a little different. If you get Mark Cuban to invest in your company, I'm not saying you're necessarily going to walk away from that, but what I'm saying is that as a portrayal of what often happens in real pitches and deal negotiations, there aren't that many 24-hour shot clocks. The other thing about it is that although there are certain things that they often speak about, right? They want to know revenue, they want to know profit, they want to know growth, they want to know CAC, customer acquisition costs, like I said. There's also a lot of stuff that they don't focus on there, right? In terms of how deals are valued. So it's not just, they talk about multiples, right? They talk about multiples of cash flow, or they don't really, I don't think that often use the term EBITDA, which is really often the measure, or EBOC. So, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, or earnings before owner's comp. They don't talk in those kind of terms, but they do talk about multiples of cash flow or profit or whatever. But, there's so many other valuation factors that go into a real valuation on a deal. First of all, in different industries, a multiple of free cash flow or profit, or EBITDA, is not always the way it's measured. It's common, but there are situations where there's discounted cash flows. There are situations where you're talking about, and you see these occasionally, these high-tech companies that aren't making a profit yet, and there's different valuation methods for those. Also, there are so many other terms of the deal that never get discussed on a Shark Tank show, right? What type of equity are the investors getting, right? They always talk about, I'll get X% of the company. Well, is that really only going to be common stock, or is that going to be a preferred stock or a preferred interest where there's, a pref return on capital, or where there's a coupon, or where, there's at least a liquidation preference? Are there going to be any board seats that are given with the investment? Are there any anti-dilution rights? Are there any, restrictions on the comp that the owners can take out? There's a million other things around structure that are never discussed on the show. And by the way, which often cause, that and due diligence often cause these deals that you think companies got invested on Shark Tank that don't end up closing. In fact, I've seen, there's estimates. I've seen one where it said 30 to 40% of the deals where there's commitments on the TV show don't actually close. I heard one that said it's 43% don't close. So, talking about 60% of the deals or so, give or take, that actually close. And then this is my other criticism of Shark Tank, is that they don't do a lot of follow-up on those. They certainly do follow-ups on Scrub Daddy and Squatty Potty and all these ones that did really, really well. They'll bring them back, and they do that to show the success. And they also do that, by the way, to re-promote the product, which then helps increase sales and value, et cetera. But they don't do a lot on the ones that don't work out. They don't give you what happens. I know I find myself trying to Google a lot to see whether the deal went through, or it's a few years later and what happened. And, there are these Shark Tank blogs and sites and whatever, but some of them you can get some good updates, some of them you can't. But like the show itself doesn't really give you a realistic view of what happened in the due diligence process, whether the deal closed or not. And then if the deal closed, what happened with the companies, especially the ones that don't do as well. And to me, as a deal guy, I want to know that, right? Like, it's fun to say, oh yeah, great, so-and-so invested in the company, but they didn't really invest in the company. They gave an oral commitment on a TV show, and who knows whether the deal actually closed or not, or whether it was successful. And I think in terms of deal education, and again, I get this is not, there is some intention to give some education. I know Mark Cuban talks a lot about how the fact that he likes the fact that it encourages entrepreneurship and it exposes people to this. And it is true at a certain level. But, if it was really given education, a lot of these other things would be discussed. Now, I get it. You can't do too much of that because, frankly, what I do for a living every day is not TV show worthy. It's not interesting enough, exciting enough. Portions of what I do, there's some great negotiations or whatever, but the due diligence and the drafting of the documents and the negotiating of deal terms was not something that's going to be exciting TV. But I wish there were more of a way to follow up. And I'm going to contrast this against the podcast that I really, really like called The Pitch later in this solo cast, where they do more of this stuff, and it's similar, but we'll get there. So those are some of the things. Now, one of the things that they do, which on the positive side, that they did talk about often is intellectual property rights. Do you have any protection? Do you have patents? Do you have trademarks? Is there a moat? Is there some way that some barrier to entry. So and that's a realistic thing. That's a thing that a lot of investors look for, right? If you can have IP protection or some way, even if it's just practicality where it's difficult for somebody to get in, so that some big company can't come in with more money than you. And as Mr. Wonderful, Kevin O'Leary would say, crush you as the cockroach you are, or whatever he says. So that is appropriate. And certainly, that's part of the due diligence that's done as well, is on that IP protection to figure out how strong that is. So, I like that they cover that. That's a realistic part of deal making. And then there's also a thing about it. And again, this has to be done for television. So I get it. I'm not criticizing this, but just comparing it to real, even the Shark Tank pitches are much longer than what they show on TV. They're edited down, right? And they do a pretty good job of editing. But what that means is that there's a lot of other questions that we don't see. And it's, of course, edited in a way that's most interesting with TV, which has to be done for a TV show. I get it. But that's another reason why these pitches are sort of unrealistic, because the pitches, even on Shark Tank, are longer, and a lot of times they are in other places, not to mention the fact that the process is longer, right? They're pitching multiple investors. It's often follow-up calls from investors before there's any kind of commitment, before a term sheet is offered. And that's usually what happens. You get an LOI or a term sheet from an investor if they're interested, and that could take multiple meetings. And you might be meeting with somebody, and then they're going to bring in their partners or some analysts or whatever. And that's much more realistic than having a pitch, even on a couple of hour pitch, but certainly, which it could be, or 45 minutes or an hour or whatever it is, some of these pitches, but then it's down to 15 minutes or whatever they do on Shark Tank. So this necessary for TV, but not a realistic portrayal of how deals actually get done. And then the other thing is, maybe a misperception just on how quickly these deals get done, like, sort of what I was alluding to before. And a oversimplification, let's say, of deal structures, right? I talked about maybe classes of equity, things like that. There's a number of other things, and I won't go too far down that rabbit hole because I'm not looking to sort of give a total lecture on every part of a deal. But let's just say, it's oversimplified, and there's no question that when these deals actually get done and documented, that they're not going to be oversimplified, because the sharks are investors, and they're going to get all the investor protection, but more that normal folks get. So all that stuff that is negotiated, those are the deal terms, all the complexity that comes into those deals, we don't see any of that really on the show. So now let me contrast this a little bit to this podcast that I love, and I'm going to give them a shout out, called The Pitch. And it's Josh and Lisa Muccio who started the show. It was on Gimlet Media, which the first podcast I ever listened to was Startup Podcast, which was the thing that launched Gimlet Media. When they ended up selling Gimlet to, I think it was Spotify, they sort of shelved the Pitch show, and then Josh and Lisa bought it back, and then they brought it back on the air. And it's been running again, I think, for a couple of years, and I really like it. Listen, it's not perfect, but in contrast, it's a pitch show where people are pitching to raise capital from investors. These are not high-profile names like the Mark Cubans and the billionaires, and they don't get Richard Branson or those kind of people as a guest shark. But these are actually real investors, right? Anywhere from angel to lead VC investors in terms of size and type. And the companies that present are also more, you get a lot of consumer goods, not only, but on Shark Tank. And, you get some of that on The Pitch, but The Pitch also leans more towards the, like tech companies, things like that are maybe, realistically the higher percentage of actual companies that are fundable and raise money. And The Pitch, you hear, first of all, it's longer. Each episode is only one company pitching, right? So it's a longer period of time. You hear more of the actual pitch. And then part of every show, they actually do follow up. They talk about what happened with the investors post the show. Did they really invest? Did they actually write a check? They even will have part of the episode, sometimes the due diligence calls or the follow-up calls with the investors that they record and make part of it. So a lot of my, sort of Dealmaker mind, where I want to know, did this deal really close? What happened? Or what was the due diligence process like? Now, listen, obviously on a show like this, they still can't cover everything, but they cover much more of it, and they give you, the updates. So-and-so said they would commit, but they didn't write a check because it turned out they did some more due diligence and, decided not to, they were worried about the competition or certain things didn't check out, or they realized they had a conflict that they hadn't realized before, or whatever it is, right? Or there's been a couple of situations where the investor just went dark. I mean, the regular investors on the pitch generally don't do that, but there was one or two situations where like a new investor came in and then they sort of disappeared and they revealed that. So I think it's much more realistic in that way. And then, what they've done is something interesting. I actually considered, frankly, investing in it. I chose not to. But they also, I mean, it's a smart business on Justin and Lisa's part. They created actually a fund that where listeners can co-invest along with the investors on the show. And I think the rule of the pitch fund was that they will not invest, they'll only co-invest, meaning the fund won't invest unless one of the investors has chosen to invest in the company that pitched. So there's even an opportunity for listeners. I think that fund is now closed. I think that there is opportunity to get allocation through certain special purpose vehicles, and they may be raising another fund down the line. But that's really interesting because, you could actually have skin in the game if you want. I haven't done that for a number of reasons that I just chose not to. But even without that, I still, I don't need that. I still find it fascinating on the pitch show. So yeah, whereas I think I saw some stats that the Shark Tank pitches average about 45 minutes, or something can go over an hour or whatever, where they edited it down to 10 to 12 minutes of airtime. I think I said 15 earlier, but I'm looking at some notes most of them are 10 to 12 minutes. The pitch typically has 30 to 40 minutes of uninterrupted discussion of, meaning questions, pitch and then questions and answers with the investors. So, and they also talk a lot more about other business metrics. I saw something where there was a measurement that the pitch does triple or 300% more. So that's even more time discussing business metrics and market analysis than Shark Tank does. They also get into more sophisticated valuation discussions, in terms of different methodologies, as opposed to just, cash flow multiples. And it's just so more meat on the bone for somebody who's really, 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 really interested. I mean, episodes talk about liquidation preferences. They talk about board rights and control. They talk about anti-dilution in some of them, right? So those are some of the things. And for me, it's that follow-up. It's like knowing what happened. Now, my one little, and there's a pet peeve, in the first, several episodes, years or seasons of the show, they would sort of wrap it up entirely in the same episode. Like you'd hear where they were at least, several months out, whether all the investment came in, how they're doing, where they're going. I mean, obviously what happened after that, you wouldn't hear. Last season and this season, they started doing something a little different, which maybe a lot of listeners love. I don't love it as much, but again, this is a tiny little criticism. So where I say I have a love-hate relationship with Shark Tank, I definitely don't have a love-hate relationship with the pitch. I have a love-love relationship with the pitch with a little pet peeve, which is that they still give some of the post-pitch updates on the actual episode. So like some of the due diligence calls, who invested, whatever, but they save like the real sort of recap of where the company went and maybe some information on whether they filled out their entire round and things like that for the final episode of the season. And again, it's a choice on what they've done. Maybe there's a lot of listeners who love it. Maybe I'm in the minority. I'd actually prefer to know on the same episode, but it's not a big deal for me. It's not a big deal for me because I still get to hear what happened. And the pitch will give updates whether like equally as if things went bad or if things went good, whereas Shark Tank rarely, like I said, shows the ones that are underperforming. So, that also could, there's some studies that criticize Shark Tank for giving people an unrealistic view of the success rate of pitches and of companies. And listen, most funded companies, I remember we had an EO event where there was a professor out of the UK who did a significant study on funded companies and funds. And most people will say these stats, they've heard them in various places. Whereas let's say for every 10 investments, 7 of them go nowhere, maybe 2 of them do okay, and 1 is the big winner. So, that's the sort of general wisdom on those stats. Obviously aren't true for every single fund, but that's generally the numbers that people talk about. And you certainly don't see that on Shark Tank at all. Whereas on the pitch, they'll talk about, hey, this company went out of business, or, they're still struggling and, these did well. So I'm not saying don't watch Shark Tank. It's fun. It's interesting. They do, the banter is good. It's as entertainment. But if you really want to, have another source other than this podcast and anything else that you're doing to learn a little bit more about funded company deals, right? Investment deals by investors into companies, I would certainly say the pitch is a much better learning tool. And it's, by the way, it's also entertaining. I enjoy it. So I don't want to make it seem like, oh, you got the Shark Tank entertainment choice, or, you got this boring learning thing. No, I mean, the pitch is great fun. I think it's smartly done. It's, you actually hear more, like you even hear the investors come in and just saying hello and then rustling around. It's like they do a great job of bringing you into the room where you feel like you're almost a fly on the wall on a real pitch, whereas on Shark Tank, you really feel like you're watching a TV show, right? And it doesn't have to be an either-or thing either. So those are my thoughts on Shark Tank, on the pitch, as a deal maker. And listen, I appreciate what Shark Tank has done from the beginning, just to raise the profile of entrepreneurship and raise the profile of the importance of the upside of companies that are investable and do get money and leverage it. I think at this point, most people, even, in the general public, like they got it, right? Like it's been many, many years of doing Shark Tank. And I think there would have been an opportunity to maybe evolve the show to give a sort of next level of, of understanding and education. They haven't really done that, but the pitch is definitely next level. So strongly recommend that. Shout out again to Josh and Lisa Muccio for putting that show together. Big fan. All right, folks, till next week when I'll have another great guest. Take care.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of Deal Quest, where we help you understand how deal-driven growth can be your ticket to freedom. If you are interested in finding out more about my law firm, the services we provide to entrepreneurial and growing companies across industries all over the country, and my partner Brian Megan and I, and my amazing team, just head over to cupforlaw.com. That's cupforlaw.com. And if you want to follow more of my content, head over to my LinkedIn page where I post regularly. I'm Corey Kupfer. Until next week, wishing you the freedom and financial prosperity that I know your Deal Quest will bring.